on the Middle East, where we discuss the big and interesting stories of the day. Today, I'll be talking about Fethullah Gulen, the Sunni Muslim preacher from eastern Turkey, who rose to become one of the most influential forces in the country for well over 3 decades, and the greatest enemy of Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. The pair were once allies. Gulen died this week at the age of 83 in self-imposed exile in the United States. His network of schools where Turkish girls and boys were fed a blend of science and Islam spanned the world. His army of disciples went on to rise in the bureaucracy and other key sectors in Turkey and in numerous other Islamic countries, giving Gulen outsized power. But he wielded that power for malign purposes. Gulen allegedly engineered the 2016 coup to violently overthrow Erdogan. The coup failed, but its results were devastating for Turkey's fragile democracy. With us here to discuss his legacy and the impact of his death is Selim Koru, a Turkish analyst who authors Kültürkampf, one of the best blogs on Turkey around. Giran, it's great to have you back on our podcast.
Thank you for having me again.
So lots of stuff going on, and from you, we want to hear the Kurdish perspective, the PKK perspective of what's actually going on right now between the Turkish state, Abdullah Ocalan, and the PKK. We all know what Turkey wants, and President Erdogan's been quite transparent about it, as has his nationalist ally, Devlet Bahçeli, basically asking the PKK to just surrender, capitulate, and for the Kurds of northeastern Syria to dismantle their self-administration and for their forces to somehow just disappear or disarm, without ever telling us what the Kurds would get in exchange. How does the PKK view this? How do the Kurds more generally look at this new phase, shall we say?
Well, I actually really appreciate this opportunity because I think from the last few weeks, we've heard a lot about what is informing the Turkish state's approach or new approach to this issue. Very surprising maneuver in the last few weeks. Your reporting actually was the first out there that said that the Turkish state is worried about some regional developments, especially in regards to the Israel-Iran conflict, and that was informing their renewed approach to the Kurdish issue. But over the last few weeks, we've not really heard how the very same regional developments impacting, informing the PKK and the Kurdish side's approach to the same maneuver by the Turkish government over the last few weeks. And that's why I think this is a very important question. And I believe that if we look at it through just a very rational perspective, if the Turkish state believes the regional developments and conflicts are going to benefit the Kurds somehow, and they want to get ahead of this by softening their tone or reaching out to the Kurdish side and floating the idea of a potential peace process again, even floating the idea of the release of the PKK leader Abdullah Ocalan from prison, this would, rationally thinking, have the Kurdish side very suspicious, because if the Turkish state is wanting to get ahead of maybe some potential Kurdish gains, then the Kurds, you'd think, would be very weary and actually would want to wait this time out, because the Turkish state's thinking is that the Kurds are going to benefit from a regional conflagration and further conflict in the region. So my response to this, though, would be that the Kurdish movement generally over the last 5 decades almost hasn't thought about the Kurdish issue in its totality, hasn't calculated the destiny of all 4 parts in one go. For the PKK especially, the Kurdish issue inside the borders of Turkey is like the mothership. It's where the Kurdish issue, both the regional Kurdish issue and the one inside Turkey, starts and ends. We see this when we look at northern Syria. Turkish policy towards northern Syria is a direct consequence or extension of its Kurdish policy within the borders of Turkey. When Turkey and the PKK are negotiating or were seemingly negotiating a peaceful resolution to the Kurdish conflict between 2013 and 2015, then Turkey's policies towards northern Syria were softer. Syrian Kurdish politicians were visiting Ankara during that time.
Right, but I think we're kind of putting the cart before the horse here, because in 2013, again, making sure that the Kurds didn't, benefit from that situation was really what was motivating the security establishment, at least in Ankara. So again, they were trying to get ahead of that situation by somehow harnessing Kurdish support in their endeavor to prevent Kurdish gains, which sounds kind of like a contradiction, right? And on the other hand, you had Recep Tayyip Erdogan, of course, looking at his political future and seeking Kurdish support for his plans for an executive presidency. And now today, again, we have a situation where Erdogan is in need of Kurdish votes in order to change the constitution so that he may run a third time, because the balance inside Turkey has shifted pretty dramatically, where the far-right nationalist architecture has collapsed, with E-Party in sort of total meltdown, Devlet Bahçeli's votes going steadily down, and then this mayor of Ankara, who is a CHP figure, but we all know to be a right-wing nationalist, emerging in most polls as the most popular leader in Turkey, therefore ready to swoop in on all of those nationalist votes and pulling the rug from under Erdogan's feet. So this is the sort of what we have before us. So when you're the PKK, what do you do? What do you think is realistic? And how do you go about it? And where does Öcalan fit in?
So the war between the Turkish state and the PKK, there is a conflict between two opposing sides. The Turkish state sees any kind of Kurdish status, both inside Turkey and regionally, as an existential issue for itself. That's the Turkish state's position. The Kurdish position, the PKK position, is a fight for some Kurdish status or autonomy, whichever way you want to describe it. These are two polar opposite positions. There is, over the last almost 5 decades, plenty of evidence that the PKK is not going to be able to achieve its goals purely militarily. It's not going to be able to defeat the second largest army in NATO. On the other side, we have a Turkish state that has been unable to defeat the PKK militarily for more than 4 decades, even with the technological advancements it has procured in the last 6, 7, 8 years. Drone warfare, airstrikes, superior military capabilities, and have been unable to defeat the PKK. So both sides have to accept that they have not been able to achieve their goals militarily. This, by definition, puts a peace process on the table, whether today, 6 months down the road, 6 years down the road, 60 years down the road. So this conflict does not have a military solution on both sides. When we accept this, the next question then becomes, as students of political science, we know that any kind of political decision from a political actor, first and foremost, has to be in the interest of that political party. So the criticism for each side, for whichever side, and right now we're leveling that against Erdogan, that he is self-interested in pursuing this process, to me is such an obvious truth that it doesn't even need mentioning. At the end of the day, we know that many states and political parties will not undertake massive political decisions at their own expense. We know that political parties are first and foremost self-interested, which is, as accepted by political sciences, par for the course. So the question here then becomes why Erdogan or why Bahçeli believe that softening their tone on the Kurdish issue, politicizing the Kurdish issue rather than securitizing it, is to their interest. And so I believe that while there could be suspicions on both on the Kurdish side, but also in the Turkish opposition about Erdogan's self-interest, we should take this aspect of it as a win, that Erdogan sees a dialogue with the Kurds within his political interests is something we should take as a win. Because for the last 10 years, he's seen militarizing this issue in his interest.
Well, but we've been here before, and the difference is that I would argue, however much he's accumulated all this power, he is in a more fragile position domestically. The economy is like gone to hell. His ratings have gone down. He lost an election for the first time in March to the opposition. So that's the real win, meaning what exactly? That the Kurdish side has a stronger hand, however much militarily they may be on the defensive, politically they're stronger. And so what is it realistically that they can aim for that can be a win-win for everybody? Okay, we know what's motivating Erdogan, we know what's motivating Bahçeli, we also know what's motivating the other side, but what can the sides achieve realistically? And shouldn't we be, I would argue, focusing on Turkey, not Syria, not Iraq, not Iran? This movement was born in Turkey out of Turkish Kurdish grievances. So that's where you start, right? And so what steps do you believe, does the PKK believe, should, and Abdullah Ocalan obviously believe, need to be taken for this to become serious and to produce a positive, lasting result?
So I too agree that the parameters of this process should be within the borders of Turkey. And in response to your question, actually, I would like to say that maybe Özgür Özel, the leader of the main opposition party, the CHP in Turkey, made the most articulate statement regarding what the Kurds could potentially gain from this process, and that was their own state. Now, obviously, his statement was a bit of a play on words, whereby he wasn't saying that the Kurds should be given their an independent Kurdish state, but that the Turkish state should be made theirs, that the Turkish state should also be a state for Kurds. And I would say that that is the main demand of the approximately 20 million Kurds living inside Turkey. They have shown through their support of political parties in Turkey, namely the Dem Party right now, that they're not fighting or demanding an independent Kurdish state. They're demanding for equal rights inside the unitary borders of Turkey. And so I would say that the biggest gain that, or the biggest demand that the Kurds can make during this process within the borders of Turkey is to ensure that the Turkish state, the state of Turkey, should be a state for Kurds as much as it is a state for Turks. So while the risks of this process remain, and I believe the last failed attempt is very live in everyone's memory and full of lessons for both sides, those suspicions and those risks and those lessons hopefully will ensure that the Kurds will not give away anything before they get something in return from the Turkish state. And
what would those things be? I mean, yes, equality, obviously, because that's what was lacking. Kurds were treated like second-class citizens, their identity, language suppressed. So we could start by obviously acknowledging their existence, right? And
absolutely. So
that starts with language, right?
The Kurdish language is still being suppressed. Kurds are still unable to learn their own language at school. And beyond that, making Kurdish political demands is still criminalized in Turkey. There are thousands of members of pro-Kurdish political parties and organizations behind bars. The former co-chairs of the HDP, Selahattin Demirtaş and Figen Yüksekdağ, are still behind bars and have been behind bars for almost 10 years now. And so freeing those political prisoners would be a big part of any process, would be a very preliminary step, actually.
The conundrum, though, I would argue is that for Erdogan is that, you can't be perceived to be doing that for Kurds only. Whatever changes you make should be of a kind that promote democracy, equality, and justice for all citizens of Turkey. So that would be the real revolution here, wouldn't it? After a decade, as you pointed out, of authoritarianism and democratic backsliding.
So I would say, in response to it, and I've seen some of these comments, obviously, from very intelligent people who believe that the Kurdish issue and the democratization of Turkey are two separate things. That is simply not true. When authoritarianism in Turkey deepens, the Kurds bear the brunt. So I believe it is a little unfair when people believe that a solution to the Kurdish issue could lead Turkey to more authoritarianism is a little unfair.
That's utter nonsense. But I mean, the question I was posing is Erdogan also willing to, allow Osman Kavala to leave jail? He's got to be consistent. He's got to apply the same principles to all citizens of Turkey.
I agree.
He may have bitten off more than he can chew, but he is a bold man, a courageous man, and so maybe a bigger shift than we were even discussing is afoot. But obviously, we have to wait and see.
I agree. And if and when the Kurdish issue is solved, the struggle for democracy still continues inside Turkey. What I don't like to see is somehow expecting the Kurds to put off a solution to their conflict because Turkey might be more authoritarian. Now, it's a little unfair, I think, when you have that expectation of millions.
I know, but I think our audience might get a bit lost in all the sort of convoluted thinking here in Turkey. But basically, if we want to summarize it, they I guess the broader public, because there's so much opposition now that's developed, resentment of Erdogan, that to see the Kurds cut some kind of deal that would enable him to remain in power seems almost like, just very unsavory to them. So that's why it needs to be explained to the broader public in, very clear terms. And here the media obviously plays a big role, that what is good for the Kurds is good for all Turkish citizens. And that's why I say that's the big challenge for Erdogan, because he's got to loosen the screws on the media. He's got to allow, and I'm sure there'll be parts of the security establishment that will again be deeply opposed to this whole process. So it's a minefield out there. And that's why I believe how the PKK and Abdullah Öcalan treat this new phase, what they do, what they seek is of utmost importance in terms of convincing the Turkish public as well. And one potential, I think, good faith gesture would be for the PKK to perhaps call a unilateral ceasefire at this stage. What do you think, Giran?
So I think we are beyond unilateral steps at this point. In all honesty, the PKK, I think, if I'm not mistaken, up until now have declared 9 unilateral ceasefires. If that was the most significant step, it would have worked by now, and it simply hasn't. And I think especially the last peace process really did show us that unilateral steps or good faith steps at very preliminary stages of such a process are not as impactful as people might think. We are in a time now where the Turkish state is constantly bombing the Kurdistan region of Iraq. And we don't see that in our media as much. But when something happens in Ankara, it's way more, it's on the media, it's on the agenda, and people think that the conflict just erupted out of nowhere and we have a new round of violence. But the conflict and the war has been ongoing for years without break. And the Turkish intelligence and the Turkish military are very proud of the fact that they can strike the PKK both, in both the cities and the mountains of the Kurdistan region, and they have been doing so for the last 6 or 7 years, and are very proud of the fact that their drones can reach that far. But that's not trumpeted, or that's not on the media as much, and so we're kind of dislocated from that part of the conflict. And so when an action or an attack like we saw in Ankara erupts, we feel like that just happened out of nowhere. But there is a wider conflict going on, and that is part of the conflict. And that's part of the conflict that we actually are trying to solve right now.
And what we know from the public statements is that they pretty much want Öcalan to tell his men to lay down their arms. That was my story. And would they, if he told them to do that, without knowing what exactly is being offered in exchange? Would Öcalan even make that kind of call if he didn't know what was being offered in exchange?
So all of your questions are completely legitimate right now. What we do know is this: the PKK made the statement saying that Öcalan was their lead negotiator and that they would follow his directions in any process. The problem here is we can't answer your questions because the Turkish state simply will not allow Öcalan to communicate with the outside world. The first visit in more than 4 years we had was a few days ago. His nephew, Ömer Öcalan, was allowed to visit the island. And what was fascinating, actually, is that the Turkish government, for the first time, admitted that they were completely isolating Öcalan, arbitrarily, I must add. So in order to give you any kind of a response to your very fair questions, we need the Turkish state to act and allow, if they are serious about this process, to allow Abdullah Öcalan to speak and communicate to both his movement, but to the public opinion in Turkey.
Well, my understanding is that he has been communicating with the movement, and they want to make it public. Once through those private communications, they've been able to get the PKK to agree so that they can, announce publicly that the PKK has agreed to end its armed struggle against the Turkish state, and then the rest will follow. Do you see what I'm saying? That sure. Kind of seems to be the thinking. But we need to end it here, Giran. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I know that we're going to have many, many more. And let's hope that this time we get somewhere, because nobody's getting any younger. And much as Erdogan is this still charismatic figure who can pull a lot of people behind him and who's bold and does have vision, let's admit that. So does Abdullah Öcalan, and he's not getting any younger. So, something needs to happen fast. Thank you again, Giran, and talk to you soon.
Thank you very much for having me.
And this brings us to the end of our podcast. For more in-depth coverage of the Middle East, please go to our website, www.al-monitor.com. Thanks for tuning in, and goodbye.